The moment I truly realized my own family no longer saw me as a person. I was sitting at a Thanksgiving dinner table, holding a bowl of mashed potatoes nobody had asked for. Laughter filled the room. Conversation bounced back and forth from one end of the table to the other like a lively tennis match, while I sat there like an invisible net post. Not a single eye drifted my way. When I quietly stood up, put on my coat, and walked right out the front door, no one called out to stop me. In fact, no one even noticed I was gone. What they didn't know was that I wasn't just leaving Thanksgiving dinner. I was walking out of their lives forever. If you've ever been treated like air by the people you love most, maybe you'll understand my story. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Sometimes, just knowing you aren't alone in this world is a comfort. 5 years before that Thanksgiving dinner, my husband, David, passed away on a rainy Tuesday morning at a hospital in Columbus, Ohio. To this day, I still hear the flatline of the heart monitor in my mind. Sometimes I still wake up in the morning, half expecting to hear his footsteps coming down the hall. Losing him after 43 years of marriage felt like losing half of my own heartbeat. David was the absolute anchor of our family. It wasn't because he liked to run things, but because people were naturally drawn to him. He was the kind of man who would spend a whole day fixing up beat-up bikes for the neighborhood kids, or spend his weekends helping a complete stranger move furniture. When he laughed, everyone laughed with him. When he hugged you, you felt completely safe. So, when he passed, the very foundation of our family suffered a permanent collapse. At first, I thought it was just grief. Everyone processes loss differently after all. My daughter, Jennifer, buried herself completely in her work. She lived in a big, beautiful house outside Cincinnati with her husband, Brian, and their 2 daughters. My son, Michael, became distant almost overnight. He stopped calling regularly, stopped visiting, and barely even asked how I was doing. For a while, I made excuses for them. I told myself they were hurting too, and just didn't know how to show it. I thought they just needed time. But time didn't heal anything. Instead, it brought the truth to light. The first Thanksgiving without David felt incredibly strange, but we got through it. By the second year, the loneliness began to creep in like vines. By the third year, I started to notice that family gatherings revolved around everyone except me. Conversations would stop when I walked into a room. Decisions were made without ever asking for my input. I didn't feel like a mother anymore. I felt like a distant relative they kept around out of some moral obligation. Still, I refused to give up. Family meant everything to me. It always had. So, on that Thanksgiving morning, I did what I had always done to keep the traditions David and I built alive. I woke up before sunrise, brewed coffee, put an old jazz record on the turntable, and started preparing the classic dishes we'd made for generations. Sweet potato casserole, cornbread stuffing, green bean casserole, pumpkin pie, and the homemade mashed potatoes David loved so much. The recipe card for those potatoes still had David's handwriting on it. Every year, I'd run my fingers over it, feeling like he was still right there with me. That morning was quiet. Too quiet. It was the kind of silence that constantly reminds you that you live alone. I stood by the kitchen window, listening to the drip of the coffee maker, watching the snow fall in the backyard. For a split second, I imagined David standing next to me, smiling and teasing me for worrying too much. "Everything's going to be fine, Renee," he used to say. I wished I could still believe that. By noon, the kitchen smelled wonderful, and the counters were piled high with food. I had spent 2 days preparing this meal. Even though Jennifer insisted on hosting and told me I didn't need to bring a thing, I brought it anyway. Because that's what mothers do. We show our love through effort, sacrifice, and the little details no one notices until they're gone. Around 1 p.m. Jennifer called. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. "Hi, Mom." "Hi, sweetheart. Just making sure you're still coming?" "Of course." "Okay, we're super busy here. See you soon. Bye." And just like that, she hung up. No asking how I was, no warmth, no excitement. It was as cold as checking off an item on a grocery list. I stared at my phone for a long time as the silence in the kitchen grew heavy. Years ago, Jennifer would call me at least 3 times while making Thanksgiving dinner, asking about turkey temperatures and laughing over small details. Now, I felt like a chore she had to squeeze into her busy schedule. I forced the negative thoughts out of my mind. I didn't want to ruin the holiday. By 3 p.m., I had loaded everything into my SUV. Pumpkin pie, casseroles, homemade cranberry sauce, serving trays. Enough food for 15 people. As I carefully packed the car, a chilling realization hit me. I couldn't remember the last time Michael had visited me just to see how I was doing, without needing something. It felt like a punch to the stomach. Every recent visit from him had involved legal documents, questions about my finances, inquiries about my house, or checking on his father's old investments. He never asked about my health or if I was lonely. It was always just business. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment, trying to shake the uneasy feeling. Maybe I was being unfair. Maybe grief was making me hypersensitive. But deep down, I knew things had changed. The hour-long drive to Cincinnati gave me plenty of time to think. Christmases, birthdays, family vacations, soccer games, graduations. I had given my entire adult life to my children, putting them first every single time. David and I worked multiple jobs to afford a good school district for them. We gave up trips and made sacrifices they would never even know about. And I would do it all over again in a heartbeat. Because that's what parents do. But over the years, my children hadn't just stopped appreciating those sacrifices. They had stopped seeing me entirely. When I finally pulled into Jennifer's spacious driveway, there were already a dozen cars parked outside. The house was glowing with holiday lights, and laughter drifted through the windows. A small spark of hope flared up inside me. Maybe tonight would be different. Maybe we would share memories of David, laugh together, and feel like a family again. I grabbed the first casserole dish and walked up to the front door. But as I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something off. Nobody came to open the door. No one greeted me. No one even knew I had arrived. Through the window, I could see everyone gathered inside, talking and laughing. Even though I was invited, I felt like a complete stranger looking in on someone else's life. I forced a smile and reached for the doorknob. At that moment, I had no idea that before the night was over, I would uncover a secret that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my children. And I had no idea this would be my very last Thanksgiving at their table. I stood on the porch for a few seconds before opening the door myself. The sound of laughter spilled out into the cold November air. For a moment, no one noticed me. The living room was packed with relatives, neighbors, and friends. The football game was playing on TV. Kids were running down the hall, and someone was carrying a tray of drinks. The house felt warm and welcoming to everyone, except me. I walked in carrying the heavy casserole. "Hi, everyone," I said, raising my voice. A few people glanced over, then went right back to their conversations. No hugs, no excitement, no "so glad you made it." Just a few polite, obligatory nods. I kept the smile on my face, telling myself everyone was just busy. Finally, Jennifer came out of the kitchen. "Oh, hi, Mom." She gave me a quick peck on the cheek, the kind that felt more like a chore than an act of affection. "Want me to take that?" she asked. But before I could answer, she turned away. "We're running behind." And just like that, she disappeared back into the kitchen. I stood there alone, holding a steaming casserole, feeling incredibly out of place. I eventually brought the dish to the kitchen myself. The counters were overflowing. I set my homemade casserole down next to some store-bought platters. No one commented on it. No one asked what I brought, and no one said thank you. I looked around. My son-in-law, Brian, was standing by the fridge, whispering to Michael. The second they saw me looking, they went completely silent. An incredibly awkward hush fell over them. Then, Michael forced a very unnatural smile. "Hey, Mom." "Hi, honey. Happy Thanksgiving. You too." That was the extent of our conversation. A few seconds later, he turned back to Brian, lowering his voice even more. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. This wasn't just one bad moment. It was the accumulation of 100 tiny moments, all serving as a cruel reminder that I was no longer a part of their world. I wandered into the living room. My oldest granddaughter, Ashley, was staring at her phone. She didn't even look up. "Hey, Grandma." "Hi, Ashley. That's a lovely sweater." "Thanks." She went right back to her screen. Conversation over. The only person who seemed genuinely happy to see me was my youngest granddaughter, Emma. She jumped off the couch and hugged me tightly. "Grandma Renee!" Her sweet smile warmed my heart. "There's my favorite girl." "You always say that because it's true," she giggled. We talked for a few minutes about her school and her art class. It was the only genuine conversation I had all afternoon. But soon, Jennifer called Emma to help in the kitchen, and I was alone again. As more guests arrived, the house grew louder. People gathered in groups, sharing stories and drinks. I drifted from room to room, looking for a place where I fit in, a place where I wasn't just taking up space. Finally, dinner was announced. Everyone headed to the dining room, and I followed at the back of the crowd. At first, I didn't notice anything unusual, but as I looked at the table, my heart sank. The large wooden table had been extended to seat 12 people. Every single chair was taken, and every place setting was beautifully arranged. But something was missing. There was no spot for me. For nearly 20 years, I had sat in the exact same spot for Thanksgiving, right next to David. After he passed, Jennifer had kept that tradition, letting me sit there in his memory. But this year, someone else was in my seat. One of Brian's business associates was sitting there, laughing with another guest. I froze. I wondered if they had just rearranged things. Then, Jennifer noticed me. "Oh, Mom," she said, pointing casually toward a small folding table near the kitchen door. "We set up some extra seating over there." "Over there!" Those words stung deeply. At that tiny, flimsy folding table sat two noisy toddlers and an elderly neighbor with dementia. It wasn't even in the dining room. It was practically pushed into the kitchen. It was close enough to hear the family's laughter, but far enough to completely exclude me. I looked at the chair, then back at Jennifer, hoping she'd realize how hurtful this was. But she didn't. She just gave a polite smile and turned back to her fine china. I sat down quietly. No one protested. No one offered to swap seats. No one seemed to think anything was wrong. From where I sat, I could see everyone laughing together. Michael was next to Jennifer, and Brian was telling a story that had the whole table captivated. Meanwhile, I was eating my Thanksgiving dinner next to people who barely knew my name. A deep sense of humiliation washed over me. It wasn't about the folding chair itself. It was about what it represented. I had spent decades building this family and creating these traditions, and now, in the home I helped build, there wasn't even a place for me at the main table. Halfway through the meal, I got up to get a glass of water from the kitchen. As I walked down the hallway, I heard voices coming from Brian's home office. The door was slightly cracked, and I immediately recognized Michael's voice. "Once we sell the house, everything will be much easier." I froze. "Sell the house?" "I know," Brian replied, "but timing is everything. We've waited long enough." Michael sounded irritated. "It's not like Mom needs all that space anyway." My pulse quickened. They were talking about a house. But whose house? Suddenly, Jennifer came around the corner. The office door shut with a click, and the conversation stopped instantly. A few seconds later, Brian and Michael stepped out, acting completely normal. Too normal. Brian smiled at me. "Everything okay, Renee?" Renee. Not Mom. Not Mrs. Matthews. Just Renee. Like I was some distant acquaintance. "Yes," I quieted my voice. Michael completely avoided my gaze. The knot in my stomach tightened. Something was terribly wrong. The rest of the dinner went by in a blur. I started watching everyone more closely, listening to every word, looking for clues. Every time I approached a group, the conversation shifted. Every time I entered a room, certain topics vanished. I wondered if I was imagining things, but it kept happening. By the time dessert was served, I felt less like a family member and more like an unwanted guest who had stumbled into a private meeting. Then I noticed another detail. Michael and Brian kept exchanging looks. It was the kind of anxious look shared by people who are keeping a big, dangerous secret. I looked at the family photos on the dining room wall. One of them was a photo of David and me from 20 years ago. We were both smiling, so proud of our family. Back then, I thought we were unbreakable. Now, I wasn't so sure. As the laughter echoed around me, a dark thought crossed my mind. What if this wasn't just about grief? What if they were hiding something massive from me? Something to do with my home? I started putting the pieces together. The strange conversations, The missing seat at the table, the secrecy, the talk of selling a house, the unexplained behavior. Suddenly, I didn't feel hurt anymore. I felt highly alert. If they were hiding things from me, what else had they done? Who was behind it? Michael, Brian, Jennifer, or all three of them? As the dessert plates were cleared, I realized a harsh truth. I wasn't sitting with my family. I was sitting with people who were keeping a massive secret from me. And before the night was over, I intended to find out exactly what it was. I didn't confront anyone that night. It wasn't because I wasn't angry or hurt, and it certainly wasn't because I was afraid. I stayed quiet because of something David used to tell me. When people think you don't know the truth, Renee, they'll show you far more than they ever meant to hide. My husband had always been an incredible judge of character, and in that moment, I chose to take his advice. I smiled when people looked at me, nodded along to the conversations, and even took a second slice of pie I didn't want. All the while, I watched. I listened. I waited. The blue folder stayed near Brian the entire night. That alone told me everything. Whatever was inside was incredibly important. Around 9 p.m., the guests started to leave. People put on their coats, and tired children began to yawn. Goodbyes were said all around. I expected to feel relieved, but instead, I felt a strange, cold peace. The kind that comes when something inside you breaks completely. Jennifer stood by the front door, thanking her guests. Michael was helping pack up leftovers, and Brian was chatting with a neighbor. No one paid attention to me. No one cared how I felt after the earlier tension. It was as if the conversation had never happened, as if my future was just something light to discuss over dessert, like the football score. I stood quietly in the hallway, looking at the family photos on the wall. There was one from Jennifer's wedding, another from Michael's graduation, and a family Christmas photo from a few years ago. Then there was my favorite, David holding Emma when she was just a baby. He was smiling so wide, his eyes full of love. I reached out and gently touched the frame. I missed him more than anyone knew. If David were here, he would have noticed how I was treated. He would have noticed me being sent to a folding table. He would have noticed our children ignoring me. And he definitely would have noticed if someone was plotting behind my back. Suddenly, I felt incredibly alone. Not just because my husband was gone, but because I realized I had spent years pretending everything was fine. I had ignored the growing distance between myself and my children, brushing off the unanswered calls, the forgotten visits, and the cold interactions. Tonight, the illusion was gone. The truth was staring me in the face. I was no longer a priority in my children's lives, and I hadn't been for a very long time. I glanced toward the kitchen. Jennifer and Brian were laughing and chatting. Michael was staring at something on his phone. None of them looked my way. Not once. I slipped over to the coat rack, pulled on my heavy winter coat, and picked up my purse. Still, nobody noticed. For a brief second, I stood in the middle of the living room, waiting. Not to beg for attention, but because of a tiny, foolish hope, deep down, that one of my children would look up. Maybe Jennifer would say, "Mom, leaving so soon?" Maybe Michael would ask, "Are you okay?" Maybe someone would walk me to my car or give me a hug, but nobody did. The room was still alive with noise, laughter, and people. Yet I had never felt more invisible. I pushed open the front door. The biting cold air rushed in. Still, nobody looked up. I walked out, and the door clicked shut behind me. Just like that. No send-off, no goodbyes, no one calling my name. Just silence. I stood on the porch for a few seconds, staring down the dark driveway. Then, I walked toward my SUV. Every step felt heavier than the last. I wasn't just walking away from Thanksgiving. I was walking away from years of denial, denying that my family no longer valued me the way I valued them. Reaching the car, I placed my hand on the handle. Then, I turned back. The house was glowing with warm holiday lights. From the outside, it looked beautiful, like a picture-perfect family Thanksgiving. Anyone driving by would assume there was only happiness, tradition, and togetherness inside. They would never guess that a mother had just spent her evening feeling completely cast aside by the very family she had poured her life into. A single tear rolled down my cheek, and I quickly wiped it away. I wasn't feeling sorry for myself. I was mourning. Mourning the family I thought I had, the bonds I'd spent decades protecting, and the painful realization that love isn't always a two-way street. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and backed out of the driveway. Not a single person came out to say goodbye. Not one. The further I drove, the lighter I felt. I wasn't happy, but my mind had never been clearer. The fog that had clouded my judgment for years was finally lifting. As I merged onto the interstate, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't ready to go home. The word home suddenly felt completely foreign. The whispered conversations kept echoing in my mind. Once we sell the house, Grandma doesn't know about the assisted living yet. The mysterious folder. The signature. The pieces didn't fully fit together yet, but I promised myself I would find out the truth. My phone buzzed. I glanced at the screen, and for a fleeting second, hope flared up. Maybe Jennifer realized I was gone. Maybe she was worried, or wanted to apologize. But the notification wasn't from Jennifer. It wasn't from Michael, either. It was just a promotional email. I laughed bitterly. Another 20 minutes passed. No calls, no texts, nothing. They still hadn't noticed I was missing. The sting of that realization was sharper than I expected. I had been gone for nearly half an hour, and not a single soul has noticed. Right then, a memory sparked. Months ago, Robert Hayes, our family lawyer, had called me. He was David's longtime attorney and had handled almost every important legal matter in our lives. During that call, Robert had said something very unusual. "If you ever need anything, Renee, call me anytime, day or night." I hadn't thought much of it then, but now those words echoed in my mind. Day or night. A strong gut feeling took over. Instead of taking the exit toward my house, I steered the SUV onto another highway. The road leading to downtown Columbus, straight to Robert's office. The further I drove, the stronger my intuition became. David had trusted Robert completely. If something improper was happening behind my back, Robert would know exactly where to start looking. By the time I reached the city, it was nearly 10 p.m. Most of the office buildings were dark, and the streets were empty. I parked outside a small red brick building and sat in my car for a moment. Part of me wondered if I was losing my mind, but another part felt incredibly focused. I took a deep breath, grabbed my purse, and stepped out into the cold night. What I didn't know was that before this night was over, Robert Hayes would hand me something David had left behind years ago. Something that would change everything. It was a safety net my husband had prepared for me long before he passed. And once I opened it, there would be no turning back. To my surprise, the lights in Robert's office were still on. It was nearly 10 o'clock on Thanksgiving night. Most people were home with their families. But Robert was never like most people. For over 30 years, he had been far more than just our lawyer. He was one of David's closest friends. They had played golf together, argued over football games, and shared countless dinners at our house. If there was one person in this world David trusted completely, it was Robert. I walked through the front door with a racing heart. The reception area was empty, and the hallway was lit only by a dim light. Before I could even knock on Robert's office door, it swung open. He looked a bit older than the last time I'd seen him. There was more gray in his hair, and the lines around his eyes were deeper. But the concern on his face was instant and real. "Rennie." His expression changed immediately. "What's wrong?" Just that simple question almost made me burst into tears. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the first time all day someone had looked me in the eye and genuinely cared about my well-being. I fought back the tears and managed a small smile. "Happy Thanksgiving, Robert?" He studied my face, then stepped aside. "Come on in." I followed him into his office. The room smelled of coffee and old books, bringing a strange sense of comfort, like stepping back in time. Robert closed the door behind us. "Tell me what's going on." For several minutes, I couldn't find the words. It wasn't that I didn't know what to say. I just didn't know where to start. Eventually, everything came pouring out. The missing seat at the table, the hushed conversations whenever I walked near, the probing questions about assisted living, the folder, the signature, and the whispers about selling my house. Robert listened quietly, never interrupting. With each detail, his expression grew more serious. When I finished, a heavy silence filled the room. He slowly leaned back in his chair. What I feared most has happened. A cold chill ran through me. "What do you mean?" Robert looked toward a locked filing cabinet in the corner. For the first time all night, I saw genuine sadness in his eyes. David prepared for this exact possibility. I stared at him. "What possibility?" "That one day your children might start looking at you as an asset list rather than their mother." The words felt like a heavy blow to my chest. My instinct was to immediately defend them, to protect Jennifer and Michael. But everything that had happened that evening made any defense seem completely hollow. Robert stood up, walked to the filing cabinet, spun the dial on the lock, and pulled open a drawer. He took out a thick manila envelope. My heart skipped a beat. Written across the front of the envelope, in David's familiar handwriting, were the words, "For Renee only. If necessary." I stopped breathing. For a split second, it felt like my husband had reached across time and gently patted my shoulder. I recognized the handwriting instantly. The slight slant, the careful lettering, the exact same script from our old recipe cards and birthday notes. The handwriting of the man I loved for over 40 years. My hands shook as Robert placed the envelope on the desk in front of me. He gave this to me to keep safe 3 years before he passed. I couldn't take my eyes off the envelope. What is it? Robert sat back down. A backup plan. A backup plan for what? He told me never to hand this to you unless a very specific situation arose. I looked up. What situation? Robert hesitated, then said quietly, if your children ever tried to manipulate you, isolate you, or pressure you regarding family assets and your home. My chest tightened. David had seen this coming years before he died. It sounded unbelievable, yet after tonight, it made perfect sense. I slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter, several legal documents, and a thumb drive. The letter was right on top. I unfolded the paper, and the moment I saw the first line, tears blurred my vision. My dearest Renee, if you are reading this, it means something has happened that I prayed never would. I had to pause. David's voice felt so alive in those words. Robert quietly turned his chair away, giving me a moment of privacy. I kept reading. You know better than anyone how much I love our children. Everything I did in life was for you, and for them. But love should never make us blind to reality. Over the past few years, I've noticed changes. Small ones. Conversations about money. Questions about property titles. Inquiries about inheritance. Those questions started coming up far more often than inquiries about your health. I prayed I was just being paranoid. I prayed this letter would never have to be opened. But if it has been, you need to know one crucial thing. This is not your fault. A tear fell onto the paper. I read on. You always believe the best in people. It's one of the reasons I fell in love with you. But it also makes you vulnerable to those who mistake kindness for weakness. If anyone ever pressures you about your home, your finances, or your future living arrangements, do not give in out of guilt. Protect yourself. Protect your peace of mind. Protect the life we built together. My hands were shaking violently. It felt as though David were sitting right next to me, holding my hand and speaking directly to my heart. The next paragraph changed everything. Most importantly, regarding our assets, there are arrangements only Robert fully knows. I purposely set up legal protections to ensure that no one can force you into any decision that is not in your absolute best interest. Trust Robert. Trust the documents in this envelope, and most of all, trust yourself. You are far stronger than you think. Forever yours, David. By the time I reached his signature, I was crying silently. It wasn't hysterical sobbing, just quiet tears. The kind that come when deep grief and the overwhelming feeling of being loved collide. Robert handed me a tissue, and we sat in silence for a while. Eventually, I looked at the legal documents in the envelope. What are these? Robert took a deep breath. The protections David mentioned. I wiped my eyes. What kind of protections? He opened one of the folders, his tone turning very serious. Before he passed, David partially restructured your family trust. I frowned. Our trust? Yes. Robert pointed to the papers. He wanted to make absolutely sure that no assets could be transferred or altered without your direct, explicit authorization, backed by independent legal review. A strange feeling washed over me. Not fear, but a sudden awakening. For years, I had assumed our estate planning was just standard paperwork. Clearly, it wasn't. David had anticipated risks I had never even considered. Why would he do that? Robert looked straight at me. Because of what he started noticing. Like what? He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. A few years back, Michael started asking very detailed questions about the title deed to your house. I stared at him. Michael? Robert nodded. And there were serious concerns regarding Brian's financial activities as well. The room suddenly felt much colder. Financial concerns. I thought about Brian's nervous behavior earlier that evening. The folder, the secret whispers, the constant tension. Everything was starting to connect, and the picture was becoming deeply unsettling. I leaned back, trying to process it all. The Thanksgiving dinner, the talk of assisted living, the signature, David's letter, the legal protections, all of it. Then, a terrifying thought struck me. What if they've already started? Robert's face grew incredibly serious. That is exactly what we need to find out tonight. For the first time, I realized this wasn't just a painful family dispute. This was something much larger. It involved potential deception, unauthorized documents, and a plan that David had spent his final years trying to shield me from. As Robert reached for another file on his desk, I had a strong feeling that the most difficult truths were still to come. After Robert finished speaking, neither of us said a word for a long time. The office was incredibly quiet. Outside, Thanksgiving night went on as usual. Families were gathered around fireplaces. Kids were playing. And people were eating leftovers while watching football. Meanwhile, I was sitting across from a lawyer, realizing my own children might be scheming to take everything I owned. It felt completely surreal. Part of me still wanted to believe it was all a big misunderstanding. But I couldn't forget the look of sheer panic on Jennifer's face when the topic of assisted living came up. That wasn't the reaction of someone with nothing to hide. Finally, Robert broke the silence. What do you want to do tonight? I looked down at David's letter. I don't know. Do you feel comfortable going back to your house right now? The question caught me off guard. Comfortable? As your attorney, I have to ask. I thought about it. Honestly, I didn't think they would physically harm me. But emotionally and legally, that was a different story. I'm not sure, Robert nodded slowly. As a precaution, I suggest you don't go back there or contact them until we have more facts. His serious tone made me uneasy. Just as I was about to speak, my phone began to buzz aggressively on the desk. I glanced at the screen. It was Jennifer. My stomach knotted up. The phone kept ringing stubbornly. For a second, I considered answering it. Then I looked at the time. It was 11:17 p.m. I had been gone for nearly more than 2 hours. 2 hours! And only now did they notice I wasn't there. I silenced the ringer. A few seconds later, another call came in. Michael. Then Jennifer again. Robert watched quietly. They finally realized you're not there. I stared at the screen. A bitter sadness creeping into my heart. It wasn't that they were calling. It was how long it had taken them to care. I could easily picture the scene at Jennifer's house. The guests leaving. The dishes being cleared. The chatter dying down, and finally, someone casually asking, "Where's Mom?" And then the sudden realization that I had vanished. My phone buzzed again with a text from Jennifer. Mom, where are you? Followed immediately by another. Please call us, then one from Michael. We need to talk, need, not want. The distinction wasn't lost on me. For years, I had watched my son become more transactional. When he needed something, he called. When he didn't, weeks would go by without a word. Tonight was no different, only the stakes were much higher. I flipped the phone face down. Robert stayed silent, knowing we were both thinking the same thing. More texts came after another, keeping the phone constantly vibrating against the desk. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I flipped it over and opened Jennifer's latest message. Mom, please pick up. We're worried. Worried. What a strange word for them to use. Were they worried when they discussed sending me to assisted living behind my back? Were they worried when they hid that folder? Were they worried when they sat me at the kids' folding table? I doubted it. Another message popped up, this time from Brian. Renee, please call us back immediately. I narrowed my eyes. Not Mom, not Mrs. Matthews. Just Renee. Even now he couldn't hide his cold, detached attitude. Robert noticed my expression. What is it? I handed him the phone. He read the text and slowly handed it back. Interesting. That's one way to put it. The phone rang again. Brian, I declined the call. Immediately after, a text flashed on the screen. Please call back. The paperwork needs to be discussed. I froze. The paperwork. There it was. The very thing they had tried so hard to hide all evening slipped out in a moment of panic. I showed the screen to Robert, and his jaw tightened. He's being incredibly careless. I stared at the word paperwork. Not, are you safe? Not, we love you. Just the paperwork. The message was only on the screen for about 5 seconds before Brian desperately unsent it. But in those 5 seconds, I had already read it and quickly taken a screenshot. Robert actually smiled. Good thinking. You think that's important? Extremely important. For the first time all night, I saw a look of confirmation in Robert's eyes. Whatever was going on, the truth was starting to crack through their polished surface. Meanwhile, my family seemed to be completely unraveling. Just after midnight, another call came through. This time it was Emma. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Grandma! Her voice was filled with fear and relief. Oh, thank goodness. My heart softened. Unlike the others, Emma sounded genuinely concerned for me with no hidden agenda. Are you okay? I'm fine. Everyone is looking for you. I paused. Everyone? She lowered her voice to a whisper. Uncle Michael and Mom are arguing. I frowned. About what? I don't know exactly, she whispered, her voice shaking slightly. But I think I heard them arguing about a signature. I looked up at Robert, whose eyes instantly sharpened. A signature. Paperwork. A cold dread settled deep in my chest. Emma continued. I shouldn't have been listening. But I heard Uncle Michael say, if they don't find her quickly, the deal can't happen. The deal. Not family, not concern for my safety. A deal. I closed my eyes. Those words hurt more than I cared to admit. Deep down, I already knew what it meant. The constant calls, the panic, the sudden urgency, it was never about me. It was about something they needed from me. Something they thought they already had completely under their control. And now that I was gone, their entire plan was in jeopardy. Emma's voice trembled. Grandma? Are you coming back? I swallowed hard. It was a heavy question, and for the first time in my 68 years, I didn't know the answer. Back to Jennifer's house? Back to being their convenient babysitter? Back to the shell of a person who sacrificed everything only to be ignored? I'm not sure yet, sweetheart. She fell silent. Then, she said something that nearly broke my heart. I miss you already. Tears streamed down my face. After hours of manipulation, lies, and calculated moves, those simple, honest words were almost too much to bear. I love you too, Emma. After we hung up, a heavy silence returned to the office. Robert leaned back in his chair. After a long moment, he said, "They aren't looking for you because you're gone." I looked down at David's letter. "No, I know." Robert nodded slowly. "They're looking for you because whatever they are planning cannot happen without you." Looking at the missed calls from Jennifer, Michael, and Brian's, still lighting up my screen, I had to accept a painful reality. For the first time in my life, my absence was incredibly valuable to them. Not because they missed me, but because I was the final lock to whatever they were trying to gain. And I was starting to suspect that what they wanted was worth far more than just a house. I didn't go home that night. On Robert's advice, I checked into a quiet hotel near downtown Columbus. I wasn't running away. I just needed time to process everything that had happened in less than 24 hours. The lonely Thanksgiving dinner, the questions about assisted living, the suspicious folder, David's letter, the frantic calls, and Emma's mention of a deal. My sleep was restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I kept seeing David's handwriting. Protect yourself. Protect your peace of mind. The next morning at 6:30 a.m., I was sitting across from Robert again. The holiday weekend was just beginning, but neither of us had the patience to wait. Robert walked in carrying several folders, his face wearing the serious expression lawyers use when preparing to deliver bad news. "Did you sleep?" "Not much." I figured. He sat down and opened one of the files. "There's someone I want you to meet." Before I could ask who, the office door opened. A tall man in his 50s walked in. He had short, neat brown hair, a calm gaze, and a very professional demeanor. "Renee, this is Daniel Brooks." The man extended his hand. "Good to meet you, Mrs. Matthews." I shook his hand. "Nice to meet you too." Robert gestured to a chair. "Daniel is a private investigator." That caught my attention immediately. I looked at Daniel, then at Robert. "An investigator?" Daniel nodded. "Yes, ma'am." My stomach did a nervous flip. I wasn't sure I liked where this was heading. Robert crossed his hands. "A few months ago, before Thanksgiving, you reached out to me with some concerns." I frowned. I remember. Back then, my worries had been vague and hard to put into words, just small details, an uneasy feeling, Michael making strange remarks, and sudden questions about our assets. I had no proof, just a mother's intuition. Based on those concerns, Robert continued. I recommended that Daniel look into a few things. My eyes widened. I remembered the phone call and the conversation I had almost forgotten. Back in August, I had given Daniel permission to do a quiet background check. At the time, I had felt incredibly guilty, even paranoid, and had almost canceled the investigation twice. Now, I was deeply grateful I hadn't. Daniel opened a folder. What I'm about to show you is going to be very difficult to see. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. I'd rather know the truth. He nodded. That's usually the best approach. He slid the first document across the desk. It was a printed email, and I instantly recognized Michael's name. My heart began to race. What is this? Daniel pointed to the paper. These are records of communications obtained through public filings, business disclosures, and other legal research methods. I started reading, and by the middle of the first page, my heart sank completely. It was a conversation between Michael and Brian. The subject was my house. Not their house. My house. There it was in black and white, valuations, potential sale prices, and projected profits. I looked up, momentarily unable to speak. Daniel continued calmly. These discussions began about 8 months ago. 8 months, I stared at him. 8 months? Yes. The realization felt like a physical blow. While I was calling my children, sending them birthday cards, and inviting them over for dinner, they had been quietly planning to sell my home for nearly a year. Daniel slid another document toward me. This one contained messages between Brian and an unidentified real estate consultant. The phrasing sent a chill down my spine. Once Renee transitions to assisted living, the process will be much simpler. Transitions. Not moves, not chooses. Transitions. Like my entire life was just a logistical hurdle, and I was just an item to be handled. I pushed the paper away, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Daniel gave me a moment to breathe before continuing. There's more. Of course there was. There always is. The next file revealed notes from several private meetings between Michael, Brian, a financial advisor, and a real estate agent. Several conversations revolved around timing, strategy, and paperwork. One phrase appeared repeatedly. Control of assets. I felt a wave of nausea. Robert noticed immediately. You don't have to keep reading. No, I said firmly. I need to. If my family had been planning this, I had to see the whole picture, no matter how painful it was. Daniel gave a respectful nod and opened another folder. This one contained photos, surveillance pictures, and public records. There was nothing illegal about taking them, but together they told a story of a plan unfolding completely behind my back. One photo showed Michael and Brian meeting outside a title company. Another showed them walking into a law firm. A third showed them speaking with a real estate agent. The dates went back nearly a year. Nearly a year. I couldn't stop thinking about it. While I was grieving David, adjusting to living alone, and trying to keep our family traditions alive, they had been building a long-term plan to take control. Daniel set the photos aside and looked me in the eye. Mrs. Matthews, I need to ask you something important. What is it? Have you signed any documents transferring the title of your home? No. Any power of attorney documents? No. Any financial authorization forms? No. Daniel nodded. Based on what we've found so far, that matches the records. The phrasing caught my attention. Based on what you've found so far. Robert and Daniel exchanged a look, and my stomach knotted up again. What is it? Daniel hesitated, then slid the final document toward me. I looked down, and all the air left my lungs. It was a copy of a signature page. My name was clearly written on the bottom line, Renee Matthews. The signature looked incredibly real, almost perfect. Almost, but not quite. I knew my own handwriting, and that signature was not mine. I stared at it, unable to speak or breathe, my mind completely blank as I tried to process what I was looking at. Daniel finally broke the silence. We believe this signature may be unauthorized. The room was completely quiet. An unauthorized signature. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a simple mistake. It was a forged signature. A serious legal violation. I closed my eyes. Part of me wanted to deny it and convince myself there was some other explanation. But then I remembered the folder Brian had tried to hide on Thanksgiving, the panic, the secrecy, and the hushed whispers. Suddenly, everything made sense. What document is this attached to? I asked, my voice trembling. Daniel answered immediately. A preliminary power of attorney document related to a real estate transaction. My heart pounded. A real estate transaction? Yes. Robert leaned forward. This is exactly why they panicked when you vanished last night. I looked at him. What do you mean? Because for the transaction to proceed any further, they eventually would have needed to produce more documents with your actual, verified signature. The puzzle was finally complete. The frantic calls, the desperate texts, the sudden urgency. It was never about Thanksgiving. It was never about family, and it was never about me. It was about a deal, a plan, and a timeline. And now, I was no longer playing along. Daniel closed the file. There's one last thing. I took a deep breath. Tell me. His expression turned incredibly serious. Renee, the investigation shows that there is no way Michael could have pulled this off alone. Before he even finished speaking, I already knew the answer. Brian, Daniel nodded. In our assessment, Brian appears to be the central driver behind this entire operation. The room went dead silent. I replayed everything from Thanksgiving in my mind. The missing seat, the forced warmth, the hidden folder, and the constant whispers. Brian was at the center of it all. For the first time in my life, a completely new emotion replaced the grief. It wasn't sadness or mourning. It was anger. A cold, sharp, righteous anger. Because no matter how much my children had lost their way, someone had guided them to this point. Someone had convinced them that I was just an obstacle, rather than their mother. As I stared at the forged signature on that document, I realized something incredibly important. The hurt, fragile woman who had quietly walked out of Thanksgiving dinner was gone. The woman sitting in Robert's office now was someone completely different. The old Renee would have doubted herself, blamed herself, and wondered what she did wrong. But the Renee sitting here now wanted answers, and she was going to make sure they paid for what they had done. For most of my life, I believed that the truth brings comfort, that if you know the facts, you can deal with them. But that weekend, I learned a completely different lesson. Sometimes the truth has to cut you deep before it can heal you. It has to destroy the illusions you desperately want to hold on to. The forged document sat on Robert's desk between us. A simple sheet of paper representing a massive, suffocating betrayal. This wasn't a crime committed by greedy strangers. It was orchestrated by my own flesh and blood. I stared at it for a long time, trying to connect that signature to the children I had raised. The little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, the little girl who would crawl into my bed after a nightmare. How did we get here? How did property and money become more important than trust? Eventually, I pushed those thoughts aside. There would be plenty of time for grief later. Right now, I needed the facts. Robert seemed to sense the shift in my mindset. Good. I looked up. What? The way you're sitting, he explained, a slight nod in his gesture. You're not letting your emotions drive you anymore. I glanced at the folders scattered across the conference table. Maybe he was right. For the first 24 hours, I had been in complete shock. Now, a cold focus was taking over. The same calm, clear logic David always had in a crisis. Tell me everything, I said. Robert nodded and pulled out another file. Let's start with the ownership. He pulled out several documents. Property records, trust agreements, investment summaries, and deeds. These were files I had either forgotten about or never fully understood. David had always handled the complex financial side of our lives. It wasn't because I couldn't, but because we had a system. He managed the investments, and I managed our daily life. It had worked for decades. Clearly, he had also planned for the distant future. Robert pointed to the first document. This is the deed to your family home. I recognized the address instantly. The house David and I lived in for 36 years. The home where we raised Jennifer and Michael. The house that everyone suddenly seemed so interested in. What about it? Robert slid the deed closer to me. Look at the name listed as the sole owner. I looked. And then I looked again, my eyes widening. There was only one name on the deed. Renee Matthews. Not David, not his estate trust, not Michael, and not Jennifer. Just mine. It belonged entirely to me. Wait, I looked up. I always thought David and I owned it jointly. You did initially, Robert explained. But a few years before he passed, David transferred the full sole ownership to you. I blinked. I don't remember signing that. You did, during one of our estate planning meetings. It was part of a stack of documents. I searched my memory, slowly recalling a meeting, a pile of paperwork, and a long conversation about protecting our assets. I hadn't paid close attention at the time, because I trusted David completely. Clearly, I should have listened closer. Robert tapped the paper. This house is yours, Renee. Completely and legally yours. An unfamiliar feeling washed over me. It wasn't just relief, it was empowerment. For the first time, I understood why certain people were so deeply invested in my future living arrangements. I wasn't just a retired widow they had to look after. I was the sole owner of a highly valuable piece of property, and they knew it. Robert opened another folder. There's more. He pulled out a deed for a small lake cabin. My eyes widened again. The cabin? Robert offered a soft smile. You remember it? I almost forgot we still had it. Years ago, David had bought a small cabin a few hours away. We used to go there on weekends to fish, read, and escape the noise of the city. After he passed, I had barely given it a thought. The cabin is also entirely yours. Under your name only. I slowly shook my head. My mind raced back to the conversation I had overheard at Thanksgiving. Once we sell the house. Now, I wasn't sure which house they were talking about. Maybe they wanted both. The family home, the cabin, anything they could lay their hands on. Robert continued. Then there are the investment accounts. My stomach tightened. Money had never been my main focus. I valued security and independence, but the actual numbers on a bank statement rarely interested me. Today, however, those numbers meant freedom. Freedom from being manipulated. Freedom from being controlled by the people who saw me as a transaction. Robert handed me another report. The balance was far larger than I had ever imagined. I stared at the numbers. David never told me about this. He didn't want you to worry about money, Renee. That was so typical of David. Protective to a fault, always carrying the heavy lifting quietly, trying to make life easier for others, even long after he was gone. Robert pointed to several clauses in the trust documents. These assets are heavily protected through the trust structure David set up years ago. I studied the paperwork. While most of it was complicated legal jargon, one detail stood out clearly. It required multiple layers of approval, extra verification, and protective limits. David hadn't just organized our finances. He had built a fortress around them. A fortress designed to protect me. Knowing this brought tears to my eyes. Even now, all these years later, he was still looking out for me. Robert paused, letting me process before continuing. The most important thing for you to understand is this. Without your direct, written authorization, nobody can legally touch or transfer these assets. Those words carried an incredible weight. Nobody. Not Michael, not Jennifer, and certainly not Brian. For months, maybe years, I had subconsciously behaved as if my children held the keys to my future. Now I saw the truth. They had no power over me. The only power they had was the power I chose to give them. That realization changed something deep inside me. Daniel walked back into the room, carrying a few more documents. Excuse me, Robert, Renee. He set another folder on the desk. What is that? A little more background on Brian. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Before he even opened the folder, I think we all knew what we were going to find. Debt. The numbers on the very first page said it all. Massive debt, maxed out credit lines, failing business ventures, personal loans, and missed payments. I stared at the figures in disbelief. It was far worse than I had ever imagined. Daniel chose his words carefully. We believe these extreme financial pressures explain most of his recent actions. They explained his actions. They didn't excuse them. There was a massive difference. I studied the report, and suddenly, every single piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The sudden urgency, the secrecy, the private meetings, the pressure to look at assisted living facilities, the talks about selling the house. A desperate man facing ruin had convinced himself that any shortcut was justified, even exploiting his own family. Especially when the payoff was this large. Robert crossed his arms. Now you see why they panicked so badly when you walked out. I nodded slowly, finally understanding the full picture. My absence wasn't an emotional blow to them. It was a logistical roadblock. Their entire plan depended on access, and access depended on my cooperation. And I was no longer cooperating. I thought about the non-stop calls, the frantic texts, and all the sudden, concern. It was heartbreaking, yet strangely liberating. Once you stop believing the lies, they lose all power over you. My phone buzzed again. Jennifer. Still calling, still searching, still desperate. I stared at her name on the screen and silenced the call. It wasn't out of anger, but clarity. For years, whenever my children needed me, I would drop everything to help them, solve their problems, and make sacrifices. Not this time. This time, I was going to find out the absolute truth before deciding what came next. David's letter lay right next to my hand. His final words echoed in my mind. Trust yourself. You are far stronger than you think. For the first time since Thanksgiving dinner, I believed he was right. The frightened, overwhelmed woman who had fled Jennifer's house was gone. In her place was a woman who finally understood a simple, powerful truth. The house was never theirs, the assets were never theirs, and my future was entirely my own to decide. Before this was over, everyone involved was going to learn that lesson, including me. On Monday morning, the very first thing I did was call the bank. I didn't call Jennifer, Michael, or Brian. I called the bank. Just 3 days ago, that decision would have felt too extreme. Now, it felt like basic survival. By that point, I had spent nearly 48 hours reviewing documents with Robert and Daniel. Every hour seemed to uncover another unsettling detail. There were no dramatic, movie-like crimes. Just a slow, steady accumulation of facts. And those facts painted a picture I could no longer ignore. My family had been planning my life behind my back, and I was done being the last person to know. I sat in Robert's conference room, putting the call on speakerphone with a representative from my primary bank. The woman on the line politely introduced herself, verified my identity and social security number, and asked how she could assist me. I glanced at Robert, who gave me a supportive nod. I need a complete list of everyone who has access or secondary permissions on any of my accounts. The representative paused briefly. Of course, Mrs. Matthews. A few minutes later, she began listing the details. Most of it was expected. My checking, savings, and investment accounts. But then, she reached a section that made my stomach drop. I see here that there are a couple of authorized secondary access permissions on file. I sat up straighter. Secondary access? Yes, ma'am. I looked at Robert. Under whose name? The representative read the names. The first was no surprise. David. It was an old authorization left in the system, but the second name caught me completely off guard. Michael Matthews. I slowly closed my eyes, taking a steady breath. Can you explain exactly what level of access that permission grants? The representative detailed the terms. It didn't mean ownership or full control. He couldn't directly withdraw funds, but it gave him full visibility. He could view transactions, monitor balances, and track history. It was enough to let him know far more about my financial situation than I ever realized. When was this set up? She checked the records. About 4 years ago. 4 years ago. I immediately remembered that time. David had been very ill, and Michael had offered to help me manage the complex paperwork. At the time, it felt like a kind, supportive gesture from a responsible son. I never imagined it could be used for anything else. Remove it, I said firmly. The representative didn't hesitate. Understood, Mrs. Matthews. I am removing that access right now. A strange feeling washed over me. It wasn't a feeling of revenge, but a healthy sense of boundaries. For perhaps the first time in years, I was drawing a line in the sand. Once the call ended, Robert smiled slightly. How does that feel? I thought about it. Lighter. It was the truth. Every step felt like reclaiming a small piece of my own life. The next few hours followed a similar pattern. We contacted financial institutions, updated legal documents, changed authorizations, and reviewed files. There were no dramatic outbursts or emotional scenes, just practical, firm decisions. Yet, each decision carried the same clear message. My life belonged to me. By early evening, my phone began to ring again. Jennifer. I watched the screen light up and let it go to voicemail. A minute later, Michael called, followed by Brian. I ignored them all. It wasn't because I wanted to punish them, but because I wasn't ready to speak to them yet. The truth was, every time I saw their names, a storm of conflicting emotions rose up inside me. Love, anger, disappointment, and deep grief. A mother doesn't stop loving her children at 68, even when they've hurt her. The bond is still there, and that is exactly why the betrayal hurt so deeply. My phone buzzed with new voicemail notifications, one after another. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I listened to Jennifer's message first. Mom, please call me back. Her voice sounded incredibly strained. We need to talk. There was that word again. Need, not want. Next was Michael's. Mom, things are getting out of hand. It was an interesting choice of words, not heartbreaking or worrying, but a clinical, managerial term, as if a project had run into a minor complication. Then I listened to Brian's message. This was the one that truly caught my attention. Renee, there's been a misunderstanding here, and we need to clear it up. A misunderstanding. I almost laughed out loud. A forged signature isn't a misunderstanding. Secret meetings behind my back aren't a misunderstanding. Discussing my living arrangements without my knowledge isn't a misunderstanding. Those were deliberate choices. Later that evening, Daniel called. His voice had a tense edge I hadn't heard before. Are you sitting down, Renee? I sat up straight. What is it? I found something else. I looked over at Robert, who was reading files across the room, and put the call on speaker. Daniel continued, It's about the debt trail. Brian's financial troubles are much worse than we initially thought. I wasn't surprised, but his next words made my blood run cold. We knew about the business loans and the personal lines of credit, Daniel explained. But there is also a second mortgage on Jennifer's house. I frowned. A second mortgage on their home? Yes. The room fell silent. A second mortgage. I had no idea, and Jennifer had certainly never mentioned it to me. Daniel continued, Several of these debts appear to be tied to failed investment schemes. The picture became painfully clear. Brian wasn't just greedy. He was completely backed into a corner. And desperate people often convince themselves that unethical shortcuts are just temporary, necessary measures, until those shortcuts ruin everything. How does this involve me? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Daniel confirmed it directly. The value of the assets in your name would solve the majority of their financial problems. There it was. The truth they had tried so hard to hide. My assets. Not me, but my assets. That distinction was crucial because it made me realize the ultimate motive behind everything. It was never about my well-being or my future. It was about money. A profound sadness washed over me. I thought back to all the hushed whispers, the averted glances, and the hidden documents at Thanksgiving. Every single road led back to money. After the call ended, I sat quietly for a few minutes. Finally, Robert spoke. "You're still grieving, Renee." I looked up. "You're mourning the illusion of the family you thought you had." His words hit me with painful accuracy. That was exactly what I was doing. The facts were incredibly hurtful, but the collapse of my trust was far worse. The belief that family always acts out of love, that every mistake has good intentions, and that loyalty is a given. All of those beliefs had been shattered. With night falling, I made one final decision, perhaps the most important one yet. I called my insurance providers, my estate planners, and the institutions handling David's trust. One by one, I updated security protocols, added verification steps, and reinforced my legal protections. There were no dramatic retaliations, just extremely tight asset management. By the time I finished, any possible path they could have used to access my assets without my direct, verified involvement was completely sealed off. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt safe. Not just physically safe, but legally and financially secure. My phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Jennifer, Michael, or Brian. It was Emma. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart." "Grandma!" Her voice was filled with immense relief. "Yes, I'm here. I assume you were hoping I'd pick up." I smiled gently. "I will always answer your calls, Emma." After a brief pause, she shared something unexpected. "Mom and Dad are fighting." I exchanged a glance with Robert. "About what, honey?" "I think it's about money." "Money. Always money." A wave of sadness hit me as yet another discovery pointed back to the exact same motive. Emma hesitated, then lowered her voice. "I heard Dad shouting," he said. "Everything is falling apart." I narrowed my eyes. Everything. He didn't mean Thanksgiving dinner or their family bond. He meant his plan, the strategy to gain control of my assets, was completely ruined. As the call ended, I found myself staring out the window at the city lights. The sun had set, and the streetlights were beginning to flicker. For the first time, I realized a vital truth. Thanksgiving didn't destroy my family. It simply forced the truth into the open. The masks were slipping, and the lies were unraveling. Beneath all the excuses, the real motives were finally clear. The question was no longer whether they had a plan to exploit me. The evidence had already answered that. The real question was how far they were willing to go, and whether they realized that I was no longer the passive woman they thought they could control. 3 days after Thanksgiving, I officially went missing. At least, that was how it looked to my family. But the reality wasn't nearly as dramatic. I hadn't vanished into thin air. I had simply stopped being constantly available. For years, my life had been an open door. Anyone could call, anyone could visit, and anyone could demand my time, help, or attention. And I had always said yes. Now, that door was shut. Not forever, but just long enough for me to take a breath, think, and remember who I was before I became everyone else's solution. That was why, on a cold December morning, I found myself driving north on a winding highway. My destination was nearly 3 hours away. A quiet cabin hidden by a lake. It was a place David loved deeply, and one that most of the family had practically forgotten. Around noon, the cabin appeared through the trees. It was a simple rustic structure with weathered wood siding, a stone chimney, and a wide front porch. It wasn't luxury, but it was peaceful. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. Memories came rushing back. Weekend fishing trips, quiet mornings drinking coffee on the porch with David, long walks along the water, and talking about growing old together. Dreams that we never got to fully realize. I parked the SUV and sat quietly for a few minutes. The lake glistened under the pale winter sky, and snow covered the shoreline. The entire place felt untouched by the betrayal and chaos I had left behind in Columbus. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I felt a genuine sense of peace. The inside of the cabin was exactly as I remembered. David's fishing rods still hung in the corner. A few old sat on the shelves, and a stack of books rested by the fireplace. One of those books still had David's bookmark tucked inside. I carefully picked it up. It was a simple receipt from a hardware store, dated 3 years ago. For some reason, that tiny detail brought tears to my eyes. That's how grief works. It isn't always the massive events that break you down. Sometimes it's a forgotten receipt, a coffee mug, or an old jacket hanging in a closet. The small, real remnants of a life shared. I spent the afternoon unpacking, building a fire, and making tea while watching the snow fall over the lake. For the first time in years, nobody needed me to do anything, and nobody expected anything from me. The silence felt unfamiliar at first, then comforting, and finally, necessary. That evening, my phone vibrated, constantly with calls, texts, and voicemails from Jennifer, Michael, and Brian. I ignored them all. It wasn't about revenge. I simply wasn't ready to hear their explanations. Explanations are usually what people offer after they get caught. Whereas, the truth exists long before that. Around 7 p.m., another call came in. Emma. I answered immediately. Hi, sweetheart. Her relief was clear. Oh, thank goodness. Are you okay? I've been so worried about you. Unlike the others, she sounded completely genuine, with no hidden agenda. Just pure, simple care, the kind of care family is supposed to have for one another. I'm fine, Emma. Where are you? I smiled gently. In a very quiet place. She let out a soft laugh. That sounds wonderful. It really is. After a short pause, her voice dropped. Things are really bad here. I sat up. What do you mean? Everyone is constantly arguing. About what? Mostly, about you. I stared into the fireplace. About me? Dad keeps fighting with Mom. That caught my attention. Brian and Jennifer, the center of the storm. What are they fighting about? Emma hesitated. Money. Always money. A wave of sadness washed over me. Because every new detail inevitably pointed to the same motive. It was never about love. It was always about assets. Emma continued. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I know. Sweetheart, it's okay. But I heard Dad yelling. My stomach tightened. What did he say? After another pause, she said, He said, this was supposed to be finished by now. Finished. The word echoed in my mind, as if a process had been interrupted or a timeline delayed. What else? He told Mom. You ruined everything. I closed my eyes, unable to speak for a moment. It wasn't just that the words were harsh. It was that they confirmed my worst fears. You don't tell someone they ruined everything unless you were expecting a specific, highly valuable outcome that has now fallen through. Emma's voice trembled. I'm sorry, Grandma. None of this is your fault. I know, honey. But she didn't sound convinced. Like many children in tense households, she was carrying a burden that wasn't hers to bear. I steered the conversation back to safer topics, her school, her art, her friends. For a few minutes, the call felt entirely normal and warm. Then, she shared something I never expected. There's one more thing, she said, her tone turning very serious. I think you need to know. I leaned forward as the fire crackled in the hearth. What is it? Emma took a deep breath. Last week, before Thanksgiving, some people came over to the house. I listened intently. Who? I don't know them. But they were talking in Dad's office. My heart sped up. The office. The same room where I had overheard the whispers on Thanksgiving night. The room where all the secrets seemed to be kept. I didn't mean to listen, she apologized again. But I heard Uncle Michael's voice in there too. This got my full attention. What were they discussing? Emma lowered her voice. Your house. I wasn't surprised, but I stayed quiet to let her continue. They kept using your name. They said once all the papers were signed, everything would be much easier. Signed, the signature, the documents, the approvals. Everything pointed to the forged document, the real estate discussions, and their desperate financial situation. Then, Emma said something that changed everything. I recorded part of it. Time seemed to stop. I thought I had misheard her. What? I recorded the conversation. I sat completely still. You recorded them? It was an accident. I was trying to record a video to send to a friend. She sounded nervous. I didn't realize it was serious. The fire crackled loudly, and neither of us said a word for several seconds. Finally, I asked, do you still have the recording? Yes. My mind raced. A recording. Not rumors or suspicions, but actual undeniable proof. I can send it to you, Grandma. I stared into the flames, realizing the entire situation had just shifted. Until now, most of our clues had come from financial records and background checks. Those were useful, but circumstantial. A recording of their actual voices was on a completely different level. It was a direct window into the truth. Would you be willing to send that to me, Emma? Of course, I offered a sad smile. Thank you, sweetheart. After we hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the lake was swallowed by darkness, but the cabin remained warm and still. Yet, my mind was racing. Emma, the recording, the house, the signature, the plan. All the threads were finally pulling together toward the truth. For the first time, I began to realize that the most critical piece of evidence my family feared wasn't hidden in a bank ledger or a legal file. It was sitting on a teenager's phone, waiting to reveal exactly what they said when they thought no one was listening. The video arrived the next morning. I stared at the notification on my screen for a full minute before opening it. It wasn't that I couldn't use the phone. I was simply afraid of what I would hear. Sometimes, suspecting the truth is much easier than having it confirmed. The file wasn't long, under 7 minutes. But those 7 minutes would permanently alter how I viewed my family. I immediately forwarded it to Robert and then to Daniel. Within an hour, the three of us were gathered in Robert's office once again, Staring at the laptop on his desk, nobody spoke. Finally, Robert pressed play. The video was shaky, clearly recorded by accident. The lens pointed mostly at the floor, with occasional glimpses of furniture. The voices drifted in from the adjacent room, Brian's home office. The recording started with casual background noise and footsteps. Then, a familiar voice came through. "Michael, we can't keep waiting forever." My stomach tightened. Michael replied, "I know." The office was dead silent as we listened to the recording. The conversation went on, spoken with the absolute freedom of people who believed they were entirely alone. Michael sounded irritated. "She's not going to volunteer." Volunteer? What an interesting word. Not agree or choose. Volunteer, as if my cooperation was simply an annoying obstacle. Brian sighed. "That's why we need to take another approach." Another approach. That phrase sent a shiver down my spine. Robert paused the video, and we sat in silence for a moment before he clicked play again. Jennifer's voice joined the conversation. "I don't like this." For the first time in weeks, I felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe Jennifer had tried to stop them. Maybe she was on my side. But the very next sentence shattered that hope entirely. "I just don't want her to find out." She wasn't saying, "I don't want to do this." She wasn't saying, "This is wrong." She didn't want to stop. She didn't object to the plan. She only objected to getting caught. A sharp ache went through my chest as the video continued. Brian's voice came back on. "Once the paperwork is finalized, none of that will matter." The room was completely quiet. The paperwork. Always the paperwork and the signatures. Robert paused the video again, and Daniel rubbed his temples. Neither man looked surprised, only deeply disappointed. I understood why. The evidence wasn't theatrical or over the top. It was far worse. It was real. It was the sound of ordinary family members discussing a selfish scheme with complete casualness. The video resumed. A few seconds later, the sentence that changed everything came through. Michael let out a soft laugh and said, "If we can prove she's confused, things become much easier." That line instantly sucked all the air right out of the room. Confused. Not elderly, not fragile. Confused. In the legal world, that is a terrifying, strategic, and highly dangerous term. In the American legal system, proving an elderly person lacks capacity means they can completely strip away her civil rights and take over everything she owns. Suddenly, every single puzzle piece fell into place. The questions about assisted living, the secret meetings, the forged signature, the relentless pressure, the artificial urgency. They weren't just trying to influence me. They were actively discussing how to completely strip me of my legal control. Daniel leaned forward, his voice low. "That phrasing is extremely concerning." Extremely concerning. The investigator's polite way of sounding the alarm. Robert pressed play again, and the dialogue grew even more chilling. Jennifer sounded nervous. "What if she refuses?" Brian answered without a second of hesitation. "Then we'll just have to move faster. Move faster. Not, let's rethink this. Not, let's stop. Move faster." The absolute confidence in his voice sent shivers down my spine because it hinted at a plan already in motion, prearranged and picking up momentum. This wasn't a casual conversation. This was an active strategy. Then came another voice. Michael again. Once the house is sold, most of the problems disappear. There it was. The house, the absolute heart of it all. Every single one of these conversations revolved around it. For this house, they were willing to sacrifice family. For this house, they were willing to manipulate, lie, and betray their own mother. The video ended shortly after. There was no dramatic villain confession, no mastermind speech. Just ordinary people sitting in a room, casually planning an act of extraordinary selfishness. And somehow, that hurt far worse than any movie script ever could. When the screen went black, nobody moved. For several minutes, the only sound in the room was the faint hum of the laptop fan. Finally, Robert closed the computer. Well, just one word, but it carried immense weight. Daniel broke the silence first. This changes the nature of everything, I slowly nodded. He was absolutely right. Until now, almost every clue we had found could have been explained away. Misunderstandings, poor judgment, bad communication, but not this. This recording revealed clear, undeniable intent. While it might not 100% open and shut case in a courtroom yet, on an emotional level, the verdict was already in. I sat there quietly, trying to process it all, trying to connect those voices on the recording to the children I loved. Because that was still the hardest part. I loved them. Even now, even after everything, love doesn't just vanish with the flick of a switch. I wished it were that simple. Eventually, Robert opened a different folder. What's next? I looked up. The question hung heavily between us. What's next? If you had asked me a month ago, my answer would have been completely different. I would have avoided the conflict, protected their feelings, made excuses for them, and accepted whatever flimsy explanation they offered. But not anymore. I thought about the kids' folding table at Thanksgiving, the ignored arrival, the conversations that stopped the second I walked in, the forced concern, the hidden files, this video, David's letter, all of it. And then, I made my decision. I want to see them. Both men looked surprised. Are you sure? Robert asked. Yes. You don't have to rush into this, Renee. I'm not rushing. I had known I was going to do this for a while. The decision felt calm, certain, and inevitable. I wasn't looking for revenge. I was looking for the truth. There is a world of difference between the two. Daniel leaned back in his chair. If we're going to do this, we should do it here. I nodded. Agreed. Neutral territory, a professional environment, and witnesses present. No screaming matches in someone's kitchen, no emotional blackmail, and no manipulation. Just the facts. Robert opened his calendar. We can arrange that. For the next hour, we discussed the logistics, the dates, the documents, the evidence, the legal considerations, and the practical details. Yet beneath all of that, a different reality was sinking in. Very soon, I would be sitting across from my children, looking them in the eye, and hearing whatever explanation they chose to offer. Part of me was terrified, but another part was ready. Because the suspense was far worse than the truth. At least the truth would bring closure. As the meeting wrapped up, Robert handed me a document. I recognized it instantly. It was an amendment to my estate planning, my trust, and my beneficiaries. I looked up. What does this mean? You want me to make a choice right now? I studied the pages. Everything suddenly felt incredibly real. For years, I had taken it for granted that my estate would automatically pass to my children. Now I understood a vital truth. Inheritance is not an entitlement. It is built on trust, and trust can be broken. Robert chose his words carefully. You don't have to make any decisions today, Renee. I nodded. But a part of me had already made up its mind. Not on the specific details or the exact percentages, but on a much deeper level. I knew with absolute certainty that my future would never again be governed by guilt, obligation, or fear. That afternoon, as I left the office, snow was gently falling. The world looked incredibly peaceful. Almost beautiful. Life is funny that way. Everything can be chaotic on the inside, while the outside remains perfectly still. I stood by my car for a long moment, thinking about the memories, the grief, and the healing. Then I got into the driver's seat, because the next chapter was coming. The confrontation, the meeting, and the moment the secret would finally be brought into the light. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I wasn't afraid of that moment. I was ready. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday, exactly 10 days after Thanksgiving. 10 days since I had walked out of Jennifer's house without a single person noticing. It felt like 10 years. I arrived at Robert Hayes's office 15 minutes early. It wasn't because I was nervous, but because I needed a moment of solitude. I needed to breathe and remind myself why I was sitting here. The conference room was spacious and professional, centered around a large, polished wooden table. On one end sat several neat legal folders, with a few bottles of water placed around the room. Everything was calm, orderly, and controlled. A stark contrast to the emotions about to walk through that door. Robert sat next to me, while Daniel took a seat in a chair against the wall. Neither man said much. There was nothing left to say. The evidence was clear, the decisions were made, and now it was time for the truth to speak. At exactly 10 a.m., the door opened. Jennifer walked in first. Seeing her, my heart broke just a little.